Okay. Thank you ever so much for the invite to speak today. It's a great pleasure to be doing this, at least remotely. It would have been even better to be there in person, but there we are. We know the reasons why. I hope you're all doing very well and looking after yourselves. So yes, the design of time. This is a talk that I've really enjoyed giving a number of times over the years because, in my view, the most quintessential topic of analysis that matches this very popular notion of storytelling is when we have a temporal dimension to data. And what I want to do over this next 45 minutes or so, and by the way, there will be time at the end. If you've got any questions, I will please pick them up at the end and answer them at the end rather than through the talk itself. But there will be time at the end for that. But what I want to do over this next 45 minutes or so is go through a variety of different methods, different techniques for how you might visualize time-based data and time-based analysis. Something that I'm sure we all encounter as analysts at some point in our work. And what I'm going to do is structure these different examples around 6 different headings. And in a sense, this talk will be a showcase. It'll be like a glossy magazine. I know that in previous lectures that you've had from seminars like this, you've had maybe more theoretical discussions, maybe more about some of the kind of contemporary techniques in different ways of thinking about the research in data viz. What I want to do is just inspire. I want to give you a sense of the wide variety of options and techniques that people are using, and to really kind of inspire you to think more creatively about the ways that you might portray time-based data. Now, just to say before we start, these slides will be shared with you, and each slide has the original title and the creator, as well as the URL to visit it on the website as well. So don't try and make too many notes, just sit back and watch, and as I said, hopefully be inspired. Now, there's 6 different chapters or sections that I'm going to look at. First of all, we're going to look at trends. So chart types, where the main story is about continuous patterns and trends over time. We'll then move on to timelines, where we're looking at more discrete events and when they happen and what their relationships are. But then move on to changes, when you compare things over time. Cycles, when we look at phases and seasonality in data. Geotemporal, when we look at how things have changed over geographical displays. And then lastly, sequences, where we look at multiples and frames and animations. So first up, trends, where the main story, the main analysis is concerned with data that has continuous attributes, and we are looking to surface the key patterns amongst those different series. And inevitably, we must start with the line chart. This is a recent line chart published by The Economist in the UK, looking at what's called the normalcy index. In other words, the degree of normal life that exists across different countries of the world. Now, one of the reasons why I really like this piece is there's a lot of content. There's a lot of different lines included, a lot of series for all the countries. But editorially, the creators have picked out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, just 6 different stories amongst those many, many countries. China, US, the EU, the world at large, Britain and India. And I think one of the key things that we always need to make sure we think about with creating things like line charts, especially when we've got many series to plot, is what's most important. What can be emphasized, highlighted, brought to the foreground? What things can be maybe put into the midground? And then what things can be pushed into the background? Still visible, still present, but subdued and quiet. And furthermore, again, very much in the spirit of storytelling, those milestones, those annotations that give you a sense of memory of what was happening at different points around the world as we follow this track over the last 2 years. Still a line chart, but this next method I wanted to show you is a very popular technique that's emerging right now, which is in the spirit of draw what you think. And these are simple charts where you are, as a reader, invited to draw the shape of the line that you expect it to look like. And once you've drawn it, it then shows you how your estimate compares with other people who participated. But then it gives you the actual, it gives you the answer. So you can then compare how good, how close your guess was compared to reality. So in this example, we are looking at the average spend per person in Britain on the National Health Service. So you draw your estimate, and then once you've finished it, it gives you the actual answer. And I think it's a wonderful way to get people to think about something, to think about what they know about something first, before you then tell them. It creates that very sort of fertile groundwork for people to then be better informed or to have their estimate confirmed as good. Now, another variation of, I guess, kind of line chart techniques is the area chart. And one of my favorite pieces from recent times is this work by Moritz Stefaner, working with Scientific American. And they looked at the history of language and the patterns of language to mark the 175th anniversary of the magazine, and how the use of language has changed and flowed and modified over those decades. And these individual line charts / area charts, I pick these out because they are beautiful. Line charts do not need to have to be the default line charts that we see in Excel or as generated by R. We can style them. We can make them beautiful. We can almost soften their shape just to give people an impression of trends. And then through coloring, we can find evocative ways to capture the essence of the language and the eras as you go from 1850s right the way through to the modern days. Now, with many data sets that we work with, uncertainty exists. And I think uncertainty as a topic is perhaps one of the biggest issues in data viz right now. This is a classic approach demonstrated in this case by the Bank of England using what's called a fan chart, where you've got the actual up to the point of where this was at the in the first quarter of 2018. And then we get these forecasts that show you the likely passage going forward, with the shaded bandings indicate the increasing likelihood in dark, and then the less likely passages in those lighter shades. And increasingly, we're having to find novel ways to demonstrate uncertainties, to demonstrate changes and ranges of values. I mean, one of the enduring chart types is the Candlestick chart, or the OHLC chart, the opening, highest, lowest and closing chart, often seen in the stock market. And this shows the range of values and almost the range of uncertainty, the range of volatility day in, day out. What I love about these is, although they are quite complex to decode, especially if you are looking at them for the first time, those who do use these, those who do encounter these on a daily basis, have become so familiar with their shapes and their meaning that there's a whole new language emerged to offer a shortcut description of these different shapes. The big green candle, the hanging man, the spinning top, these are now shortcuts to represent the shapes that gives a whole new meaning to interpretation. Obviously, politics is completely mired in uncertainty, ever increasingly so as well. And again, what we shouldn't do is be put off by uncertainty, be put off by range of values that may all have equal value and merit. And one of the organizations that I do respect in terms of how they handle probabilities, possibilities, forecasts is 538 in the US. So in recent times, this is a very popular project from them, looking at the ratings, the popularity ratings of presidents in the US. And this shows the passage of Donald Trump's popularity and also by contrast his unpopularity. But we've got the line chart wrapped around these dot plots, these spreads that give us a sense of the kind of the range of possible values, the projections, the possible bandings that might exist. And I think this reflects perhaps an increasing maturity that exists now amongst a lot of publishers who know that the audience will be well equipped to make sense of these quite complex and statistical displays. And so long as you make things as clear as possible, so long as you explain things like you see in the bottom left with the key for the estimate and the projection, I think we can smarten the audience up rather than necessarily dumb our choices down. And another example from 538, not about politics, but about football, about soccer. This is a very novel approach to looking at the probabilities of either team winning the match in the World Cup. And so we've got all these different pairings. So in the top left, we've got Uruguay versus Portugal. And across the 90 minutes of the match, as you go left to right, it shows, in this case, the decreasing likelihood of Portugal beating Uruguay. And at the end, as you reach the end of the match, Uruguay do indeed win, and they move through to the quarterfinals. So again, it's a very unusual, novel approach to showing live dynamic probabilities and how they shift through the course of a match. Another technique that involves the core use of what we might consider a line chart, but is the bump chart. And the bump chart is used to show rankings. Rather than absolute numbers, it's about plotting ranks. What you've got here in the UK is an interactive project where you can look up the popularity of boy or girl names given to babies when born. And you can see how those rankings of popular names have changed over time. So this is the current version, up to date as of 2020. And what we see plotted here are the current top 100 names and where they were ranked through history. Now, I've picked out 4 examples there to show the trajectory, and that's what it's about. It's about the changing nature of those up and down rises into the final rankings as we see now. Some are quite stable, so Elizabeth is quite stable. Others are emerging from almost nowhere, from the 900s almost, to join the top 100 names. Again, a variation of the bump chart is what's called the Alluvial Chart, where you show both rankings, but also encode some degree of size of value. So this is a piece of analysis looking at the time story of the popularity of different meats, proteins in this case, as consumed in the US. So the position of a given coloured slice indicates its rank, but then its absolute size is the average amount of pounds of that protein consumed per year. So you can see that beef has dominated the US meals up until, what's that position, about 2003, at which point, 2004, at which point chicken takes over, and that then dominates at the top. Going further into an even more kind of unusual and flowing diagram, this is called the stream graph. And this is looking at the refugee totals as immigrants into the into the UK, based on the origin of each person. And again, the relative size at any given point is the amount of refugees coming into the country during that year, but the relative position indicates their rank. So for example, you can see in the last 5 or 6 years, most refugees have come in from Syria, up until 2020 when it shifted to people coming in from Iran. Back in 2001, at the start of the Afghan conflict, you can see the Afghanistan kind of peak rose around that time. These kind of displays are not intended for precision in readability. They're often more leaning towards getting a feel for data, trying to understand the ebb and flow of concurrent values. Any chart trying to plot this data would be complex. And so sometimes it's more about just where the headlines are rather than exactly how much total refugees have come from Eritrea at any given point on that timeline. Another complex looking display, but actually I find this to be a really compelling piece of analysis, which looks at the US and over time and under these different presidents, all these little blue markers indicate different tax thresholds. In other words, every time you reach a blue marker, when you earn more money than that, you pay a different level of tax. And what this shows is the complexity of the tax system in the early 1900s, right up until sort of the 1950s and 60s. And then you see this simplification, this sudden reduction under Ford and Carter and Reagan. And then we get down to just 2 tax brackets. And now we see this return to 5, 6, 7. So it looks complex, but sometimes you are showing complexity. And that's the point. It goes from complex to simple. Another method that's been extremely popular, certainly this year, given the COP26 event in Glasgow, is this method of these sort of striped maps. Ed Hawkins is a climate scientist from the University of Reading, and he's popularized these over the last few years, and they are now everywhere. Greta Thunberg is tweeting them out inevitably. They are appearing in the bottom left there at music concerts and festivals as more and more activists want people to be aware of the increasing global situation. And so this method has leapt beyond the boundaries of data viz. And almost everybody around the world is starting to see these techniques that give people a sense of, yeah, this is turning into a bad story. We need to do something about it now. Urgency. A similar topic, but a different sort of variation of that. What I like about this, it looks at the decreasing reliance in Britain on the use of coal for electric power. And you can see day by day, 2012 onwards, how the reliance has dropped. What I like about this is the color metaphors. We have coal, black, dirty, and then it gets lighter and cleaner and cleaner and cleaner. And then when we hit zero reliance, it flicks over to green. And so not only is it an effective chart type, but it's very clever in how it's being executed with those color choices. And inevitably COVID. There's a few more COVID charts to come, but the use of an area, heat map, to color code over the course of time for different age groups, the average rate of cases per 100,000 populations. To show, in this case, it's kind of a reverse colors. So black is low, white, intense heat is high. And this matches how the UK came out of lockdown around May, June. And then in the summer, when there was a big football event, the European Championships, you can see right in the middle of the month of July, that's when there was a major final, and inevitably a lot of youngsters, people a little bit younger than me, unfortunately caught the disease. But it's a very effective display of lots and lots of data points. That's the biggest section. Timelines is about discrete events, when things have happened and for how long they have elapsed. So the first example is actually a very different material. This is knitting. And this is a scarf produced by a lady in Germany, in Munich. And she was so angry about her trains being delayed every day getting to work that she decided to stitch and knit patterns to mark every event of delay. And you can see those red areas. These are when both trips into and out of work have been delayed by more than 30 minutes. So she created this scarf, and actually the train company bought it from her and donated a large amount of money to charity. So a nice outcome, but it's about events, when things have happened in a more kind of categorical, almost qualitative sense. A similar approach here where we're looking at movies. Movies that are based or apparently based on true stories. So what you've got here is across the duration of each movie, you have people who have watched the movies and have graded whether each scene or passage in that movie is true, true-ish, false, or false-ish. And so you get these resulting almost kind of barcode displays that give you a sense of the rhythm and the flow and the truthfulness, or otherwise, of the movies themselves. And I think it's quite revealing when you see these patterns and you think back to watching any of these movies. A similar kind of approach in this case, but now very much more qualitative inquiry, looking at the testimonies given in the Supreme Court nomination when there was this testimony between Ford and Kavanaugh, and they were interviewed in the US Senate. And what you've got are the transcripts, and they've been color-coded to indicate every occasion in which either person answered a question in blue or avoided answering a question in pink. And even though you can't read the words, you can step back and see that big version, and you can see the patterns of blue and the interchange of blue and pink and blue and pink, and even the size and the length itself is a message, is a kind of a takeaway from that display. Going back to a more classic kind of chronological display, there are many different ways that we can use markers to indicate events. This is looking at the increasing number of lawsuits faced by and challenged by Airbnb. So there was one in 2011, nothing in 2012, and then we get these little dots. This is a technique called B-swarm plots. The vertical is just an arrangement. It's not a vertical axis. You just arrange and stack things up when they occupy a similar position on the x-axis to give a sense of the distribution and the skew. Another qualitative inquiry looking at the use of language by US presidents down the years. This looks at the language used in the State of the Union address, which I think is given every January by each US president. And across these different themes down the y-axis, and there are many more beyond the screen that I've cropped there, the size indicates the frequency of that word or that term being used in the script. The colours indicate the party of the president at that point in time, but you can see the kind of dominance of the words like America, American, especially since the 1950s onwards. You can see actually the infrequent mention of the word democracy, relatively speaking, over time. As you go through the full project, there are many fascinating insights into the use of language in this huge body of data. Another timeline approach where you've almost got this spiral, almost like a board game layout. Over time, you've got these little faces that indicate in the in UK politics when a minister in government has resigned or been required to resign. So again, you've got this sort of story flowing, and this is a reverse layout. Not only is it vertical, but it starts at the present and goes down into the past. We often are trapped in this left to right, past to present sequence, but be creative. Think about new ways of showing sort of layouts of time, past to present, in novel ways. One of my favorite projects, this is looking at the occasions in which these different Avengers characters have appeared in the Marvel Action Comics. So over time, a little marker indicates an appearance. And what I love about this is it's not just each individual marker telling a story. You get a sense of the consistency and the relentless appearance of Captain America. But you also get moments when he's not in the comics. I want to know what happens around 2007 through to 2012. You get the first occasions. You get the last occasions. You get these real dense periods like for Goliath, whether he or she was, you get this intensity of 67 to 72, and then nothing for about 30, 40 years. So there's loads of little stories emerge when you look closely at these displays. Another example from US politics, but I found this fascinating, looking at how many presidents have been alive at the same time through history. And this was because I think at the point in time, it was almost unprecedented for, I think, 7 US presidents to be alive simultaneously, whether they are in office or, of course, retired and left office. But this is using both a line chart to track the total, the running total, but then with a Gantt chart to show you the start point, the end point of office, and then how long they lived beyond their term. And it takes me to another very kind of increasingly popular chart type called the Lexis chart or the Lexis diagram, looking at duration. And again, we've got a novel sort of vertical display from past down to present. And these indicate the age when appointed of the justices in the Supreme Court. And then the length of their serving life ends at the point at which they either unfortunately pass away or they leave office. So again, it's a very detailed, dense display, but there's lots of stories that emerge when you start to look closely at these kind of diagrams. Another quick piece about US politics, and we've got a very complicated work that looks at the apparent sentiment of US presidents through their body language when they deliver their inaugural speeches. So the duration in this case is the full length of a speech, but then every branch is a detectable sentiment. And if it's very long, it's a very strong sentiment. If it's very short, it's barely detectable. But if it's a negative sentiment, it goes down. If it's positive, it goes up. And you get this overall sense of gravity, bending this tree down or bending it up to give a sense of the overall sort of sentiment, of the overall mood of the person delivering that speech. Back to the world of movies, and a very clever piece which decodes trailers of movies and tries to work out what's in the trailer, where does that actually appear in the final movie? Because of course, people creating these trailers will pick different sections from different parts of the movie. It's not always chronological. The trailer for the Silver Linings Playbook movie was quite chronological, but as you can see in the Lincoln trailer there, different extracts were taken from all sorts of different positions and stuck together to create a very kind of mismatched view of the overall movie itself. Again, these take a while to decode. That's not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, so long as you are given the information you need to work out how to perceive it and then how to interpret it. Onto a project I worked on, which I have down here. And this is a huge book of charts and analysis to visualize Seinfeld, the sitcom. And I looked at every single episode and gathered data about the appearance on screen of every character, when they were on screen and when they were not on screen, but also when they caused the laugh. At the bottom, you see the different locations that were used across the duration of the scenes in every episode. So these, again, are difficult sometimes to decode quickly, but once you've worked out the patterns, you can start to unlock lots of insights. And these kind of displays, to me, feel almost musical, almost like an arrangement of musical score. And on the note of music, and specifically audio, increasingly we see techniques using sonification. One such method, which I don't think any of these audios will play over my track, so you'll have to just imagine it and maybe visit the website after the event. But this first example takes the frequency of every commentary and how quick it took them to reach every unit of 500 deaths. And what this does is it creates rhythm, it creates speed, it creates pulsing, and it can be transposed into audio format where you get this relentless noise, which becomes quite suffocating. A more recent example, and again, I don't think the audio will come through in the broadcast, but check this out from Valentina De Filippo, London Under the Microscope. It's a wonderfully creative project that conveys this sense of the pulsing beat. Every day is a second. And it's this sense of each day, how many new cases, how many new deaths. But you've got this rising, almost this rising tide of the total number of COVID deaths. Now, in my earphone, I can hear this really sinister pulsing and this noise that feels, again, very threatening, very kind of unnerving. And it's a real sort of multi-sensory experience. Now, of course, not every project lends itself to be sonified, but where relevant, it is a very kind of exciting new world that I think is definitely worth checking out. Now, moving on, changes, discrete comparisons. The first technique is the slope graph, the simplified line chart, where you simply compare 2 points in time. So we're looking at US states and how much electric power comes from these different origins: coal, natural gas, nuclear. So we are comparing 2004 with 2014, that versus that. And that's the essence of this chapter, comparing something with something else, more so than the trends and changes. Another technique is the connected dot plot, where you're looking here at life expectancy for men and for women across different income groups. But the main comparison is between those people who were born in 1930, they are the grey dots, and those people who were born in 1960, which are the yellow dots. The positions are plotted, and then the connecting bar highlights the delta, highlights the difference. So we can now see the difference rather than having to try and calculate it from the display or the gap that exists. This is another sort of version of that, but in more of a sort of 2D space. We are looking at the US politics again. On the x-axis, the party win margins. So the more to the right, the Republicans won by a greater margin in that particular seat or that particular area. On the left, the Democrats. And what you've got are these arrows that compare 2014 election with the 2018. This is the sort of midterms. Now, again, you get this very detailed display, very cluttered display, which can be hard to make sense of. But when you see basically more arrows going that way, you can see this sort of shift, this leaning in direction. You can also interactively operate this to filter out and to focus on different subtopics. Now, the next example I want to show concerns colors. And this is the use of the tree map, where we're looking at the stock market and the rectangles are individual stocks and the color coding indicates the change over the previous 24 hours. Now, there are, of course, issues around the red-green color blindness that exists with this, but otherwise, it's another layer of detail that gives you a sense, in this case, of where the dark reds are. They've dropped. The vivid light greens, they've risen. So there's lots to decode here, but it's another way to show that sense of comparison with the previous moment. Color coding in this case is used to show across America whether spring typically starts earlier in green or starts later in blue compared to normal. So you've got these different leaves going left or right, different sizes, but also different shades of greens and different shades of blue. So you can now step back and see the overall patterns in the sort of southeast of the country compared to the northeast, the north, and the far west. You can see those patterns emerging. Sometimes the easiest way to compare changes is to use a side-by-side comparison. What happened then and how did it look there? Especially when you've got something like a map that can be very hard to encode in a very effective way to show changes. Especially when you're trying to show categorical changes, in this case, in the UK, which party won a certain electoral seat one year compared to another year. So I like both the side-by-side nature of this, but also the connecting arrow that just draws the eye's attention to the two sides that matter. And then finally, in this section for politics, the Sankey diagram, where you are looking at the flow of people who might have voted for one party in one election and where they move to, or whether they stay with the same party, in this case, 2 years later. Again, very detailed display, but when you see lots of movement, it shows you that there are lots of changes taking place. Now, cycles. These are where we typically find almost circular displays. And there's lots of different examples I could have shown here. This is one example from recent times, looking at how people spend their time on different activities. So I think it's something like a typical 200 people, and you've got these different milestones around the clock face. So 9 a.m. at the top, 9 p.m. at the bottom. And then you've got these different activities across the clock as people wake up, go to work, go to education, come home, travel, commute, sleep. So all sorts of little stories, but it's a cycle. It's a kind of continuous loop that we go through. This is an old project. I think it may actually have expired digitally, but looking at the color composition of photographs in somebody's back garden in Norway. So this guy took a photograph every day, analyzed the color composition, and then plotted on this radial display the different changing colors as you go from the white and the browns to the browny yellow greens, and then back around to the blues and oranges to show that kind of complete cycle. And weather lends itself to this, whether it's across the whole year or whether it's across the day. Lots of weather tools and applications now use this circular radial structure to give a sense of the ever-changing nature from one day, from 1 hour, of temperatures, of different rainfall patterns in different locations. I mentioned Ed Hawkins before with the climate stripes. Well, he was initially made famous from the climate radials that we see here, these spirals. And this was a really viral, effective project that, again, shows the increasing story in recent times of increasing global temperature changes. So this radial kind of looping story, quite stable, and then things erupt in more recent times. Very, very powerful display. If you've been on the internet in the last few weeks, in the last few days, you can't have avoided the discourse and the debate and the arguments and the fallouts about this piece from the New York Times, this sort of spiral looping timeline of the case totals. Some people hate it. Some people despise it for not being able to facilitate comparisons. I actually quite I find it very effective because it reminds us, well, we don't need reminded, but it conveys to me this sort of endless cycle, this relentless cycle that we are going through, what's now into the 3rd calendar year. And it's not for me about trying to read off the values. It's about the feeling of this sort of never-ending cycle that we are trapped in. And sometimes, again, charts are about feeling of data more so than the reading of data. In fact, somebody has taken that example and Amelia Wattenberg and tried to find new ways of doing it, but maybe more readable, maybe more kind of suiting the arguments of some of the people who don't like the original. So, for the data viz fields, these are healthy things to try out new methods and then to modify them and tweak them. And just to close this section, one of my favorite graphics of all time from Pedro Cruz and colleagues looking at dendrochronology. And this is looking at the migration story in the US, decade by decade, so the immigrant story, decade by decade. Every dot's 100 people. They are wrapped into these decade rings, and then the colors and the position around the clock face indicates from which part of the world they moved into America from. And it uses this metaphor of tree rings, where every decade leaves a different shape and a different sort of story behind it. Moving on to geotemporal, the where and the when, and we pick up with the same project, because the key dimension of this is not just the time, but the geography. And so another version that emerged from this is this sort of layout of the US states and the different stories of immigrants moving into that particular state compared with all the other states. And you can see the changing patterns of the parts of the world in which they've moved into those states from. So inevitably, California is largely dominated by people who moved in from Asia. In Texas and Florida, it's people moved up from Latin America. In New York, New Jersey, it's people moved over from Europe. In this next display, we see a geotemporal piece of analysis that looks at each of these cities and how far you can travel from the center of the city in, I think it's 30 minutes. Yes, 30 minutes. So this is the arteries of the city, the different road and transit routes, and you get these emerging corals. That's what it's called, coral cities. And again, these are not about reading off values, about feeling the patterns that emerge. And you can see the cities that are bound by sea. So Barcelona on the coast. You can see the cities like Paris, which is almost a perfect circle that you can travel. Another geotemporal display where we're looking at the age of buildings. On the left, we've got, these are both looking at Brooklyn in America. And the buildings are color-coded from the kind of blues and greens of the 1800s through to the sort of yellows and oranges of the 1900s, and then the darker reds of the late 20th century and the 2000s. A popular method is the grid map. And the grid map preserves a rough sense of geography. These are the different boroughs of London, different regions of London, divided by the River Thames, which sort of slices through the centre of London. But then each panel houses an area chart to show, in this case, the increasing closure of pubs and bars in all these different boroughs of London. So it gives you a sense of where, but then within the chart, it gives you a sense of the story over time. Another geo display, this is looking at the declining sea ice extent. And what you've got here is mini multiples, where from year to year, from month to month, the changes will be very hard to discern. But when you throw in, what's that, about 40 years of data, month by month, you start to see these patterns, not just through the seasons, but also over the course of time, because the eye and the brain are so capable of making sense of patterns on this scale, even at small resolution. Now, some things, of course, lend themselves to motion and to movement and to animation. This is a GIF that looks at the changing seasonal colors of the US. Day by day, we get these different colors, and you can see the northern regions that get cold and very snowy, those in the sort of southeast and the west coast that hardly get touched by snow or even cold temperatures. And again, it's something that lends itself to being stitched together into this continuous loop. And going a stage further, perhaps a stage more advanced, this Earth wind map, these beautiful sort of particle displays that animate to show the ever-changing patterns of wind movement and strengths, and these different hurricanes marching towards the kind of Gulf of Mexico. They're both beautiful and elegant, but also informative, almost the perfect harmony of everything that we are seeking in data viz. And then lastly, building on that topic of sequences and animations, but also multiples. Some things work so well when they are animated, to see a story unfolding over time. This is a simulation that models the Berlin Marathon. Now, thankfully, it's not in real time, because that would be far too boring. But all these pixels are simulated runners, and you can see the race unfold, but then you can interrogate it. You can put yourself into there. What time do you think you would finish at a marathon? And it'll give you a sense of where in this increasingly spread field you might be positioned? Where are all the people from your city in terms of the current positions? I'm sure for those of you who are certainly on Twitter in the dataviz world, you cannot have avoided the explosion of bar chart races 3 years ago, sorry. I believe this was the very first to emerge, looking at the different brand value for different companies over an 18-year period, and the kind of emergence of Apple and the sort of decline of some of the kind of older, more established large companies. But again, they work quite well in certain situations with certain data to see the ebb and flow, the movement of positions over time. And sometimes you need movement to convey scale, such as the amount of the area of the Amazon rainforest that is decimated every 30 seconds. By simulating the idea of removing trees from a football pitch that offers, at least for some people, a sense of comparison of scale. This animation, the speed of it, and the speed of the decline is a very impactful way to convey this sort of troubling perspective. Now, not everything can be animated, and sometimes we have to create multiple views. Now, this is on screen animating, but this is just a website. And the idea of this is that you've got these multiples over the structure of a calendar. The analysis here concerns the gender pay gap. And effectively, at what point in the calendar year have companies stopped paying women because men are far better paid in their organizations? And so you get these little clustered dots in each day of the year to show the ratio. And so you experience this by going to the website and browsing down the page. And as you reach different months and different days, the count on the right-hand side increases to give you a sense of how many have already been paid to the maximum extent. Some work here from the New York Times, some of the most beautiful work, these kind of photographic composites, where you cannot show something moving, you can break down the anatomy of that movement into individual still frames. Whether it's the 100 meters across 10 different seconds, where are the racers at that point? Whether it's figure skating, whether it's the slalom, these composites show you the movement, the motion, the actions, and I find them absolutely compelling things to look at. I started off this talk by talking about storytelling, and sometimes storytelling is to try and convey emotion. And I remember seeing this a few years ago. I thought it was a very emotional piece of work. This couple took the same photograph every year in their garden, every month in their garden. And you can see the changing growth of plants and patterns in the garden, the colors of the year, the weather changing. But then in the last scene, the lady is no longer there. And it's that removal, it's that emptiness, that last frame in the context of the previous 11 frames creates a very powerful leaving sentiment. And just to finish off with perhaps a slightly more humorous view of things, this is a comic from XKCD. Now, this was titled March 2020, the idea that when we reach March 2020, every month since then has been March 2020, up to the point of May 2021 when it was published. We've moved beyond that, and it kind of feels that we're still in March 2020, and so I've just annotated that differently. But again, this notion of multiples, when you can't show movement, can be a very powerful option to convey time. And so in summary, we've seen a variety of examples across showing trends, timelines and changes, cycles, geotemporal displays, and sequences. Thank you all very much for your attention to that talk. Lots of things for your brains to take on board, but again, I want you to just sort of let this sort of wash over you a little bit, and then you can visit the materials afterwards, visit the websites in the materials, and start to find methods that you can think of perhaps using in your own work as well.